this episode, we're going to bring accountability into sharp focus by looking at two things enterprises depend on every day but often fail to truly own: information assets and IT processes. Beginners often assume accountability is obvious because people have job titles, but in governance, accountability means something more specific and more enforceable. It means the enterprise can point to a clear owner for an asset or process, explain what that owner is responsible for, and require action when outcomes fall short. When accountability is unclear, information becomes scattered and inconsistent, processes become tribal knowledge, and problems bounce between teams until they become crises. When accountability is defined across owners, governance becomes practical because leaders can align expectations, measure performance, and manage risk through visible responsibility rather than through vague coordination. This topic matters on the exam because many governance failures are actually ownership failures, especially in areas like data quality, access control, change management, and service reliability. The goal here is to help you understand what it means to define accountability for information and processes, why cross-owner clarity is harder than it sounds, and how governance makes accountability real without turning everything into bureaucracy. By the end, you should be able to explain how accountability is assigned, how it is enforced across organizational boundaries, and how it reduces both risk and waste. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to define what an information asset is, because the term can sound abstract until you connect it to what organizations actually use to operate. An information asset is any information the enterprise depends on for decision-making, operations, compliance, customer service, or competitive advantage, including datasets, reports, documents, records, and the definitions that give data meaning. Information assets are not limited to sensitive personal data. They also include things like product catalog data, pricing rules, operational logs, and performance metrics that drive leadership decisions. These assets have value because they enable business actions, and they have risk because incorrect, inconsistent, or exposed information can cause harm. Governance treats information as an asset because assets require ownership, protection, and lifecycle management. Beginners sometimes think information belongs to the system where it is stored, but information often crosses systems and departments, which is why ownership must be defined at the enterprise level. If no one owns the meaning and quality of an information asset, the enterprise cannot trust its own reporting and cannot reliably meet obligations. Defining accountability is therefore how governance turns information from scattered content into managed enterprise value. When you see governance problems involving data confusion, you are often seeing unmanaged information assets. Now define what an IT process is in governance terms, because processes are often treated as operational details when they are actually major risk and value drivers. An IT process is a repeatable set of activities that produces a consistent outcome, such as managing changes, handling incidents, granting access, maintaining service performance, or tracking configuration and assets. These processes matter because they shape how reliably the enterprise can run and how safely it can evolve. A strong change process reduces outages caused by unstable changes, while a weak one turns every change into a risk event. A strong access process reduces unauthorized exposure, while a weak one creates persistent security gaps. Governance cares about processes because processes are where policy becomes behavior. A policy can say access must be approved, but the access process determines whether approval is actually consistent and evidenced. Beginners sometimes assume processes are owned by IT operations, but process ownership often needs governance oversight because processes are cross-functional, affecting business outcomes and compliance obligations. If process accountability is unclear, process performance becomes inconsistent across teams and sites, undermining enterprise reliability. Defining accountability for processes is therefore essential to repeatable governance. When you hear scenario questions about recurring incidents or inconsistent control behavior, unclear process ownership is often at the root. The word accountability needs careful treatment because enterprises often confuse responsibility, authority, and accountability, and that confusion causes governance failure. Responsibility is the obligation to do work, such as operating a system or performing a review. Authority is the permission to make decisions, such as approving a change or granting access. Accountability is the obligation to answer for outcomes and to ensure the system performs as expected, including taking corrective action when it does not. In a healthy governance model, accountability aligns with authority, so the accountable owner has levers to influence outcomes. A common beginner mistake is assigning responsibility widely and assuming accountability will happen automatically, but shared responsibility often becomes diluted responsibility when nobody is clearly accountable. Another mistake is assigning accountability to someone with no authority, which creates unfair expectations and encourages scapegoating. Governance defines accountability by explicitly naming who owns the outcome and by defining what success and failure look like. It then ensures that authority and resources are aligned so the owner can realistically deliver. When exam scenarios describe blame shifting or unclear ownership, the governance fix often involves clarifying accountability and decision rights together. This is a core principle you can reuse across many topics. Defining accountability across owners becomes challenging because information assets and IT processes rarely fit neatly within one department. Information often originates in one business function, is transformed by another, is stored in multiple systems, and is used by many teams for different purposes. Processes often involve multiple roles, such as business managers requesting changes, IT teams implementing changes, security teams reviewing risks, and operations teams supporting services after release. If accountability is not defined across these boundaries, the enterprise experiences gaps where everyone assumes someone else is handling a critical piece. Governance addresses this by defining ownership roles that are stable and enterprise-focused, such as information owners who own meaning and quality expectations, and process owners who own process design and performance. It also defines supporting roles that carry operational responsibilities, such as custodians who manage storage and access mechanisms, and operators who execute process steps. The key is that governance makes the boundaries explicit so handoffs do not become invisible. Beginners should notice that cross-owner accountability is not about central control. It is about clear coordination with a defined owner who can resolve conflicts. Without that, cross-functional work becomes political and fragile. The exam often tests this by describing situations where multiple teams touch an asset or process, but no one owns the outcome. A practical way to define accountability for information assets is to separate ownership of meaning and value from ownership of technical handling. An information owner, often on the business side, should be accountable for what the information means, what quality is required, and what the information is used for. This owner should be able to decide, for example, what fields constitute a valid customer record and what counts as an authoritative data source for customer status. A technical custodian, often on the IT side, is responsible for how the information is stored, protected, backed up, and made available, and for implementing access controls consistent with governance standards. Governance defines how these roles coordinate, because the business owner cannot set quality expectations without understanding feasibility, and the technical custodian cannot protect information without knowing sensitivity and usage. Accountability is maintained by ensuring the information owner can approve key definition changes and by ensuring the custodian can enforce handling requirements. This approach reduces a common failure pattern where business teams blame IT for data quality, while IT blames business teams for unclear definitions. When the governance model assigns clear information ownership, both sides understand their roles, and accountability becomes enforceable rather than rhetorical. Exam questions about inconsistent reporting and unclear data ownership often point toward this kind of structured accountability. Information asset accountability also includes lifecycle decisions, because information that is not managed over time becomes a risk and a cost. Governance must ensure that information owners understand retention requirements, disposal expectations, and appropriate sharing rules for their assets. For example, if an information asset includes sensitive customer information, the owner must ensure that access is approved appropriately and reviewed, and that information is not retained longer than necessary. If an asset includes operational records needed for evidence, the owner must ensure retention supports obligations and that evidence can be produced consistently. Lifecycle accountability also includes managing where the information flows, because copies and derivatives can create uncontrolled exposure. Governance supports this by establishing standards for classification and by requiring that information assets are inventoried at a meaningful level, not necessarily every file, but at the level where ownership and control decisions can be made. Beginners sometimes think inventorying information is impossible, but governance focuses on critical assets first, establishing ownership and controls where impact is highest. This approach allows progress without pretending the enterprise can map every piece of data instantly. When exam scenarios involve data being copied into unmanaged places or retention confusion, lifecycle accountability is often the missing governance element. Now shift to accountability for IT processes, because process accountability is what makes governance repeatable and measurable. A process owner is accountable for the design, effectiveness, and performance of a process, meaning they ensure the process achieves its intended outcomes and evolves as enterprise needs change. For example, a change process owner is accountable for ensuring changes are reviewed proportionally, that risky changes receive proper oversight, and that change outcomes are monitored to reduce outages. An incident process owner is accountable for ensuring incidents are detected, escalated, resolved, and learned from in a way that reduces recurrence. A request and access process owner is accountable for ensuring access is granted based on legitimate need, reviewed regularly, and removed appropriately when no longer needed. Process accountability also includes evidence, because processes often must produce records that demonstrate control operation and support audits. Governance ensures that process owners have authority to define standards, coordinate with stakeholders, and drive improvements when performance indicators show weaknesses. Beginners often assume process ownership is merely administrative, but effective process ownership is a leadership function because it shapes enterprise risk and reliability. If process ownership is unclear, process steps vary across teams, and governance loses the ability to ensure consistent control behavior. Exam scenarios about inconsistent change handling or recurring incidents often point to missing process ownership. A key challenge is that process performance depends on behavior across many teams, which means process accountability must include enforcement mechanisms and clear participation expectations. Governance cannot simply name a process owner and assume everyone will comply. It must define what roles must participate, what evidence is required, and what happens when compliance is weak. This is where decision rights and escalation matter. If a team repeatedly bypasses the change process, governance must have the authority to require compliance and to escalate issues to leadership when necessary. Process accountability also benefits from measures that reflect outcomes, such as change success rates, incident recurrence trends, and time to restore patterns, because these measures allow governance to identify whether a process is effective. The process owner uses these measures to propose improvements and to justify changes to standards and workflows. Beginners should understand that measures are not about punishing teams. They are about making the process visible so it can be improved and so risk can be managed. When measures reveal repeated failures, governance expects process owners to drive remediation, not to accept the status quo. This enforceable loop is what separates a process that exists on paper from a process that actually controls risk. On the exam, answers that include both ownership and monitoring are typically stronger than answers that include ownership alone. Defining accountability across owners also requires clarity at handoffs, because handoffs are where accountability often disappears. Consider the transition from a project into ongoing operations. If ownership of the service is unclear at launch, incidents will be handled ad hoc and risk will rise. Governance addresses this by requiring that service ownership is established before launch, that support expectations are defined, and that monitoring and controls are in place. Consider the handoff between business data owners and technical custodians when a new data source is introduced. If meaning and quality expectations are not agreed, reporting will conflict and errors will spread. Governance addresses this by requiring that data definitions and ownership are established as part of planning, not discovered after deployment. Handoffs also occur when vendors are involved, because the enterprise must still own outcomes even if the vendor operates part of the service. Governance clarifies who owns vendor management and how vendor performance is monitored as part of process accountability. Beginners often think handoffs are communication issues, but they are governance issues because they require defined ownership and decision rights. If handoffs are governed well, the enterprise becomes less dependent on informal relationships, and accountability becomes durable. Scenario questions that describe recurring post-release incidents or vendor blame games often involve weak handoff accountability. A common beginner misconception is that accountability means a single person must be responsible for everything, which can lead to unrealistic governance models. In practice, accountability can be distributed across multiple owners as long as it is explicit who owns which outcomes and how shared outcomes are coordinated. For example, a business owner may be accountable for benefit realization while an IT owner is accountable for service performance that supports those benefits. Accountability can also be layered, with local owners accountable for local outcomes and enterprise owners accountable for enterprise-wide standards and coherence. The key is that accountability must not be ambiguous, and conflicts must have a clear escalation path. Another misconception is that assigning accountability will automatically improve performance, but without authority and resources, accountability becomes frustration rather than improvement. Governance must ensure owners have the levers they need, such as the ability to enforce standards, access decision forums, and influence funding when improvements are needed. Beginners should also recognize that accountability is not about blame. It is about clarity that enables learning and action. When accountability is clear, issues are surfaced earlier and resolved more systematically. This is why accountability is a governance foundation rather than an optional administrative step. To make accountability visible and enforceable, governance often uses a combination of role definitions, decision rights, standard processes, and review rhythm. Role definitions specify who owns information assets and processes. Decision rights specify what each owner can approve and what must be escalated. Standard processes ensure that ownership is exercised consistently, and review rhythm ensures performance is monitored and issues are addressed. Evidence practices support this by making decisions traceable, such as documenting risk acceptance, recording approvals, and tracking remediation actions. This integrated system prevents accountability from becoming theoretical because owners are expected to participate in governance checkpoints and to report on measures tied to their outcomes. It also supports continuous improvement because owners can use evidence and measures to identify root causes and propose changes. Beginners should see that accountability is not a single assignment. It is a design that connects ownership to decision-making and oversight. When governance is designed this way, accountability becomes the default rather than something leaders must demand repeatedly. Exam questions that involve weak accountability often require this integrated approach rather than a simple statement that someone should be responsible. The strongest answers typically show how governance will make accountability visible, measurable, and enforceable over time. To close, defining accountability for information assets and IT processes across owners means making enterprise ownership explicit for the meaning, quality, protection, and life cycle of information, and for the design and performance of the processes that keep IT reliable and controlled. Governance accomplishes this by distinguishing responsibility, authority, and accountability, assigning clear owners for information and processes, and ensuring those owners have the authority and resources to influence outcomes. It also clarifies cross-team boundaries and handoffs so accountability does not disappear when work moves between roles, departments, or vendors. Repeatable processes, decision rights, monitoring measures, and operating rhythm make accountability enforceable by turning ownership into action and corrective improvement when performance drifts. When you can look at a governance problem and ask who owns this information, who owns this process, what outcomes are expected, and how oversight will require action, you are applying one of the most important governance skills tested by CGEIT. In the next episode, we will take this accountability foundation and evaluate the governance framework itself to find gaps, overlaps, and weak signals, because even well-designed ownership models must be tested and refined as the enterprise evolves.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.